room. The reading room. The reading room. The reading room.
This is episode 17, GoldenEye.
When a powerful satellite system goes missing, James Bond is the only one who can stop those behind it. Sent to recover the weapon dubbed GoldenEye, Bond must investigate the Janus Syndicate, who have stolen the weapon from a Russian research facility after an accident. That is GoldenEye in a nutshell. Jay, what did you remember about this before you rewatched it recently?
Yeah, so Andy, this is one of those films where I remembered details, but not necessarily about the actual film, so not necessarily about the plot. So, for example, I remembered it was Brosnan's first movie. I remembered On a Top. Sean Bean plays the main villain. Also remember that Dame Judi Dench joins the franchise as a new M. And I remember, but I couldn't remember her name or the bad guy hacker's name. So I remember that there was a Bond girl who's a goodie, and she was a computer programmer. And then the bad guy hacker, I remembered he was there. And I remembered the thing that he did with the pen, but I couldn't remember his name, which obviously turns out to be Boris. But otherwise, I didn't really remember much about the actual plot. So just kind of those factual kind of things really about the film. How about you, Andy?
Similar to you, I didn't remember the plot as such, but I remembered moments from the film. So I remember the bungee jump at the start. I remember Xenia on a top and her death grip. I remember a scene where Bond's driving a tank, and I remember the reveal of Janus in the what I'm calling a monument graveyard, kind of like a collection of old statues, and that's the moment where he's revealed. So I remember that reveal. So let's just go through some of the key information. So Alec Trevelyan is one of the main villains. He is also known as Janus and also known as 006, and we'll get onto that as we talk about the plot. Xenia on a top is another one of the villains, as well as General Uramov and Boris Grushenko. 3 Bond girls in this film, Xenia on a top being one of them, and we also have Natalia Simonova and Caroline.
The theme song in GoldenEye is called GoldenEye, and it's performed by the Queen of Rock, Tina Turner. And the opening credits, so we get the Russian sickle features quite a few times in the opening credits. We've got your usual James Bond models, but this film is obviously set in the Soviet Union, and in the opening credits we see a lot of the Soviet Union flags. We've also got the James Bond models dancing on gun barrels, and they are using sledgehammers as well, we see in the opening credits. And the note I made here, Andy, was this feels less sexualized compared to earlier films in the franchise. And I think that's probably the first time that we've had. Dr. No didn't have many models. They had the flashing circles, didn't it, in the very early films. But definitely compared to the films in the 70s and the 80s, this is definitely less sexualized. And the next point from me is the James Bond kill. So this is the body count that we're tracking, and a very healthy 47 in here. So we will see how that compares to other Bond films when we do the rankings at the end of the podcast.
Yeah, it certainly sounds high. I guess we'll see just how high later on. Some of the gadgets, there's quite a list actually for this one. We have a bungee rope gun, we have a door decoder, a grappling belt, a ballpoint pen grenade, a watch with a laser, and digital binoculars with camera. So quite the array of toys for Bond to play with in this film. Bond, of course, likes to introduce himself as Bond James Bond in most films I think we've seen so far, and in this one it takes him 19 minutes and 35 seconds before we hear the line. We do see him drinking a martini, but there's no hat wearing or hat throwing, so there's just a couple of other things we're tracking as well. Now Jay, next question, very important one. What was your favourite scene from the film?
For me, Andy, there was one scene that really stood out, and I can't believe I actually forgot about this one. So I remembered just before this scene takes place where Bond looks outside and sees a tank, I remember straight away, oh yeah, this film's got that epic tank chase scene. But I didn't remember it before we rewatched GoldenEye. So the tank chase scene for me was the standout scene. there were a lot of action scenes, but this is the one that I think was the most enjoyable. How about you, Andy?
Yeah, I completely agree. The tank chase was the one for me that really stood out. I have put an honourable mention for a scene between Bond and M. And I think we're going to discuss that in a little bit more detail later on, but there's a scene back at MI6 where the two of them are chatting, and I just thought it was a really, really powerful scene, and we'll get onto the detail of that later on as we talk through the film. Another question from me, Jay. How many times did you reach for your phone watching this?
A big 0, Andy. I was very disciplined, and I paid full attention to this. Brosnan's first film, been looking forward to this one, and my wife has been looking forward to this one, as I mentioned a few times on the pod, and she was playing on her phone quite a bit. So yeah, for me it was a 0. How about you?
Same. I was really, really into this film. The debut of a new Bond is always quite interesting for me, and it's been a long time since I've seen the Brosnan films. In fact, I'm not sure I've seen them more than maybe once or twice each, so I was interested to see how they would fare up. But yeah, I was just really into it, so I didn't need my phone at all. One more question. This is very, very important for the rating room, and that is the rating. So what did you give this out of 10?
I gave GoldenEye 8 out of 10, Andy, and before rewatching this film for this week's episode, I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, oh, this one could be a 9 or potentially a 10 out of 10. But it was an 8. It was a solid 8, and obviously we're going to talk about where that ranks on our list later on in the episode. So I think it's a healthy 8. How about you, Andy?
I went with a 7. I almost went with an 8, but I went with a 7. We'll talk about various plot points and such, but I thought it was a very strong debut from Brosnan, a very strong film on the whole, but there were a few things that just kind of bugged me a little bit, or were a little bit silly, or just kind of held it back a little bit for me. But I would say a very, very strong debut overall. And in the past, I've been quite stingy with my marks, as listeners will attest to. So a 7 is actually pretty good for me, I would say.
It is you're less generous than me in this, in the scoring. And I can't remember, Andy, if I just said that, but I agree. I don't think this was as good as I remembered. But like I said, 8 and your 7 are very healthy scores. And it's a good start to the Brosnan era.
And hopefully that continues, but I guess we'll find out over the coming weeks. I said one more question, I lied. I've actually got another one. And it's the all-important one, and that is, what did your wife think of the film?
When me and the wife watch the Bond films, what we usually do is I have an A4 pad and I write lots of notes down. And after the film finishes, I say to the missus, what do you think? And then she'll just say a couple of points to me, and I just put some bullet points down and I type them up. This week, I made the mistake of saying to the wife, because it was late when we finished watching this film, I said to the wife, tell me tomorrow, think about it. And then the next day, when I was typing up some of the notes, I made the mistake of giving the missus my notepad. So she wrote quite a few sentences about what she thought of GoldenEye. So I'm just gonna go through those points now. So she said, you can tell the time difference between The Living Daylights and GoldenEye, and I agree with this point. So she says GoldenEye feels a lot more modern, especially in terms of the technology that's involved in the film, and I agree with that, Andy. And I think we spoke about it outside of the podcast. For me, this is the first Bond film that feels a modern Bond film, and it's the one where I think I was 14 when this GoldenEye first came out. So it's the one I really remember as growing up, being a teenager. She also said the action scenes feel better, and she didn't notice the stunt doubles. She didn't like the crazy characteristics of On a Top, and she felt sometimes it came across a bit over the top and a little forced. Overall, she agreed it wasn't as good as she remembered, but she was still looking forward to the next one, and she enjoys the Pierce Brosnan era. And as I mentioned, earlier on and numerous times throughout the podcast season, she's just been looking forward to the Brosnan era while we've been working through, the Connery, Lazenby, Roger Moore films, and Timothy Dalton. And her final remark was in her top 5 so far in the franchise. So it'd be interesting to see whether GoldenEye makes our top 5, Andy, as well. And that was what my wife thought. Did you manage to get your wife to watch it this week?
No, my wife remains absent from podcasting folklore for the time being. I did ask her if she fancied starting from Brosnan. I thought this would be a good place for her to start, and I was met with complete silence. So I took that as a no. But I do have a world exclusive for you here, and that is I have a verbal agreement that she will at the very least watch No Time to Die, the final Bond, or the final one so far. That I have as a verbal agreement. I'm going to see if I can push that and make it maybe a few Craig films, maybe all the Craig films, but for the time being, I've got verbal agreement of one film at least.
Will you get that written in blood or anything? Or are you going to happy to take that as a verbal agreement?
I think I'm gonna make a follow-up to make sure that minds have not been changed or plans have not been made on the day that we're going to watch that. So I will follow that up, but for the time being, I'm taking that as it's going to happen.
You heard that first, listeners. That is an exclusive, like Andy said. But Andy, sorry, just before we move on, does she know anything about the plot or the ending of that film without giving spoilers away?
She does. She's heard from various people things that have happened, and I'm not sure if that's going to ruin her enjoyment of it or not, to be honest. But I think she was told certain plot points because I don't think she ever had any intention of watching it, so therefore it didn't matter to her.
Well, we look forward to that, and you can check in, Andy, when we get to the last episode of this season, although we are doing an end of season special, so we are going to do a 26th episode for season 1, and we can obviously listen out for Andy if his wife does come in earlier on the Daniel Craig films. Because you said previously, did you say she's watched some of Casino Royale?
She has watched some of Casino Royale, or she was certainly in the room with me while I watched it. She may have fallen asleep at some point, but that's not Craig's fault. That's time of day. So I'm not having Daniel Craig blamed for my wife being sleepy on that night. No way.
It could be quite fitting that she was there at the beginning and the end of the Craig era.
There will be a nice little bow wrapped around it all. But let's watch this space. So episode 21 through 25 are the ones to listen out for, because we're going to get insight that we've never heard before. Maybe. Let's get into a couple of facts before you move on to some of the talking points. So the runtime for this is 2 hours 10 minutes, and with the entire franchise so far, they've all been there or thereabouts that sort of time. So I was kind of expecting this to be slightly longer, but no, it falls right in the ballpark of most of the Bond films so far. This was released in 1995 when Jay claimed to be only 14 years old. That's to be determined. That sounds like his maths may be a bit out there. And this was the first of 2 Bond films directed by Martin Campbell.
My maths is correct, Andy. So moving on, so this is some of the general points that we kind of cover each episode. And as usual, I like to kick off with the money. So let's talk about the budget. So GoldenEye had a $60 million budget, and that makes it the most expensive Bond film so far in the franchise. And when you look at that compared to the previous film that obviously came out 6 years ago, License to Kill, that was an $18 million increase. So that's quite a big increase. I mean, I don't know in terms of inflation and what the budgets were for other films around that time in 1995, but that was a big increase compared to the other films in the franchise. How did that 60 million budget correlate in terms of box office stats? It smashed the box office record taken so far, and at that point in time, it took $356.4 million, and when you adjust that, it equates to $672.8 million, and that's a staggering increase of $146.1 million. And after the disappointing box office performance of the Dalton movies, and we spoke about that in the previous episode, this firmly put the franchise back on track. So I don't know, Andy, if you have any kind of comments talking about the money there.
It's a massive increase in budget, absolutely, but it does feel like a big budget Bond. In certain, it felt big, which we'll get into in certain of the details. But I guess what it does is prove the old saying that you get what you pay for, or you've got to speculate to accumulate, or whatever those sayings are. But certainly, it's a massive return on a pretty big budget.
So my next point here, before I pass over to Andy, is Andy mentioned Martin Campbell directs GoldenEye, and Martin Campbell went on to direct a number of other movies after GoldenEye, including 2 Zorro films, Green Lantern with Ryan Reynolds, The Foreigner with Jackie Chan, and recently released Liam Neeson movie Memory, which I can't remember if it's on Prime or Netflix, but it's about a hitman that has early onset dementia. So it's on my watch list, Andy, and if I remember, I will hopefully get round to watching it.
I see what you did there. There you go. Free advertising for you, Mr. Neeson. A couple of other points. So GoldenEye was the first Bond film to have been filmed on location inside the former Soviet Union. The country was banned from all 16 previous movies. So that's a little change in direction there. And in quite sad news, Cubby Broccoli died shortly after the film was released. Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson took the lead producer roles, and Albert Broccoli took a role that allowed him to oversee the production of GoldenEye and was credited as a presenter. So that's a sad fact to end on from our talking points.
The Rain Room.
Let's lighten the mood a little bit, though, and go with some goofs and continuity errors. Blech. Let's say that itself is a goof and continuity error. Let's go with some goofs and continuity errors to lighten the mood a little bit. So James Bond does his bungee jump down the side of a dam, and it looks like it's the beginning of spring, or around that time. But when he emerges from the factory, it's winter. It's clearly winter, and there's also no dam in sight. They're on a mountaintop, and that whole thing just kind of blows my mind a little bit. Like, are we missing big chunks of story, or did they make edits there? Like what happened?
Yeah, or when I don't know, because you could argue when they went inside the dam and they were doing various bits, and when he escaped, maybe they came out quite far away from the dam, but it just didn't seem obvious that there was a dam about when they came out. Also, Andy, at the end of the movie, you see all the Marines reveal themselves, and this is a surprise to Bond and Natalia, which is fair enough. You can understand that doing camouflage. But also at the same time, 3 helicopters come in from the top of the screen, which apparently no one has heard or seen until that second, which is very weird because obviously helicopters make lots of noise. So that, and obviously as well, apart from making lots of noise, they'd be moving wind around as well in terms of the propellers. And that reminded me as well from Russia with Love, where Rosa Klebb goes to meet Red Grant, and she's walking, through the grounds of this complex, and she walks through, you see some bushes, and she kind of moves to the next scene, and then that's where you got all the goons shooting guns. I think there's a flamethrower, there's fighting and everything, but beforehand, while she was walking and talking to the other bloke, who I cannot remember his name, you hear none of that, and it just brought back memories of that film from Russia with Love. This scene did. And another point from me was when Bond and Natalia eject from the helicopter, so where they've been caught, you clearly see that there's 2 white parachutes, but then when the capsule lands, the scene shows that the parachutes are actually red and white. And if you Google this or use any other search engine out there, you can actually see that as well. So if you miss that when you're watching it through, you can actually see the difference with the white and the red and white.
That's a good spot. I missed that one. There's another one as well at the start of the movie where Bond is fighting the man on the runaway plane. Bond jumps out of the plane with the pilot. They hit the motorcycle, and you see Bond in midair, and he's got no gloves on. But then when he gets back on the motorcycle, he's got black leather gloves on. So again, another continuity error there. Or maybe, he decided to put some gloves on in midair. Who knows?
reading room.
But let's get into the film. So the opening scene, as always, is the gun barrel. Some interesting tidbits on the gun barrel. Daniel Kleinman takes over from Maurice Binder, who sadly died in 1991, as the lead designer of the famous gun barrel sequence. And this is the first time the gun barrel sequence was computer generated, although it still resembles the original gun barrel image.
That is interesting, Andy. Also, what's interesting, Andy, is that Brosnan shoots one-handed and stands very upright. And we've obviously mentioned in previous episodes that the different actors have kind of put their own spin on the gun barrel sequence. But Brosnan very much shoots one-handed and stands upright. And I'm kind of doing the motion now, which obviously this is not a visual podcast. So the only people that can benefit from this is my co-host, Andy.
It was tremendous, I assure you, listeners.
And I was watching YouTube. Someone had put together all the gun barrel sequences together, and I was watching them over the other day. And it's interesting to see the different kind of spin that the actors put on. I wonder whether I'm guessing they pick how they want to do it. Is there a creative spin? I can't imagine the director having much of a say on that particular scene. They might come up with some points, but I think, if you Pierce Brosnan, I was practicing this in the mirror, before I came in. I think this will work. And then, the other actor saying, oh no, I come down with one knee and shoot.
I'd imagine it's one of those scenes that's probably filmed several times and they pick the best one. But the general motion is the same each time, isn't it? It's not like there are wild variations. There are subtle variations, but nothing wild. It's not like you've got one of the Bonds doing a cartwheel and then a forward roll and then like shooting behind his head or anything. But yeah, I wonder what the process is for something like that, because on the surface it's quite a simple scene and it's a very short part of the film, but it's actually quite iconic, dare I say. So you've got to get it right.
You have. And can you imagine someone like Clint Eastwood, very famous actor, obviously did lots of westerns. If he kind of did his like sharpshooter, kind of spin it. You don't see any of the Bond actors kind of like do, some of like swirly around with the fingers. And I can't remember if it was me or you said in the previous episode, like a Tarantino one as well, Sideways Gone, kind of rocking it.
Yeah, kind of Gangland style.
Yes.
Not Gangnam style.
But we digress. So this sequence is also used in the next two films. So we've said before, sometimes they reshoot them. Obviously, you had to reshoot them with different actors, but sometimes they reshoot them throughout. And as we said before, in the Roger Moore ones, they have different coloured tints to the background, etc. But for GoldenEye, Tomorrow Never Dies, and The World Is Not Enough, they use the same sequence.
Yeah, one thing as well I noticed, the music was very, very different to previous films, and I wasn't a fan. It just sounded odd to me.
I agree, Andy. It was, when it first came on, it felt quite electronic. And I think we talk about it later on, or we definitely made a note that this Bond film, the soundtrack did include some electronic elements to it. But we're in the 90s, Andy, so maybe that was the fad. I don't know. I'm trying to think what was around when I was 14 years old. I'm sure it was Oasis and Blur, and maybe drum and bass and other kind of house music or whatever.
You're certainly right around about the Britpop type bands. I can't imagine. Can you imagine a Britpop single for Bond? Anyway, we digress. But yeah, not a fan. But maybe it was of the time. Be good to get listeners' thoughts if they agree with me or whether I think I'm talking nonsense. But following that, we're on a dam in the Soviet Union. We see a man who we will find out shortly is James Bond running along the top. And we're treated to the memorable scene where Bond jumps off the dam, does a bungee jump. Now, for me, it was very obvious that it wasn't Brosnan at any point, even when he was just running. So, whilst I understand the need for stunt doubles for a scene like a bungee jump, do you really need a stunt double to do your running for you? That seems very, very lazy on the part of Brosnan, dare I say.
I'm nodding here, Andy, and I think I would have a stunt double for any kind of running. I would. I'm just too lazy. That scene, Andy, where he's running across the top that you just mentioned. if it was me, I'd have to keep cutting it and splice it all together, because I do like a few meters and I'd be like panting, like, oh, you know, folded over, then running again. So yeah, I think I would have to use a stunt double.
Yeah, I agree. Or I would insist that there's no rush. Time is not of the essence. I could just walk it. But if any listeners out there have ideas for what you could use a stunt double for in real life, I'd be interested to know what else we could apply that to. Interesting thing, I mentioned that this was a dam in the Soviet Union. In reality, it was the Contra Dam in Switzerland, or commonly known as the Verzaska Dam. And apologies for butchering that name. Verzasca, Verzaska. We'll go with that. Sounds good. After the release of GoldenEye, the dam became a popular bungee jumping venue. Thousands and thousands of people have jumped off the Contra Dam, and you can experience this yourselves for less than £200. Spoiler alert, Jay and I will not be taking part in this. And one of the reasons is, statistically, the death rate for bungee jumping is 1 in 500,000. I don't like those odds, as long as they may sound.
When we found this research and I found it was £200, I sent Andy a text to say, basically, would you do a bungee jump? And he came back and said, no, I'm scared of heights, and I'm very scared of heights. I get scared just going up the ladder into the loft. But £200, Andy, could you be swayed for that? If we had any generous podcast listeners willing to pay for you to do this in a tux, would you do it?
So I'd need the fee paying, I'd need the tux paying, I'd need the flights paying for, hotel near the venue, few nights either side, you know, just to enjoy the sights. I'm gonna need spending money as well. It's not cheap, so you know we're probably talking, you know, 50,000, 60,000 spending money, because you know I've got expensive tastes. So let's call it around £100,000. So if listeners can cobble that amount of money together, firstly, what are you doing with your lives if that's what you want to spend your money on? But secondly, if you can, then I promise you I will do the bungee jump in a tux, and we'll film it and put it on YouTube or something.
That sounds very expensive, Andy.
Spoiler alert, Jay, it's not going to happen, is it? Let's be honest.
No, that's why you've done 100,000 just in case. And Andy, say, is there a time limit to this? So if the podcast ever takes off when we're doing, you know, it might have millions and millions of listeners when we do season 10. Can we come back to this point and say, in episode 17 of season 1, Andy, you said you would do it for £100,000?
Okay, I'm currently 37 years old at time of recording. By my 40th birthday is the time limit. So listeners, get saving. But both of you. Sorry, it's my purpose on this podcast to just make Jay laugh for no reason at all. It's very unprofessional. Final point on this is the stunt was voted the best movie stunt of all time in a 2002 poll by Sky Movies.
Yeah, so the stunt was performed by Wayne Michaels, and he experienced so much G-force that he briefly lost consciousness as well. But he came to just in time to bust out the grappling gun and complete the take. So that was very lucky for Wayne. This is still the highest bungee jump record from a structure in a movie at 722 feet or 220 meters. And that is still the record, as we have checked the Guinness World Records website, and this is still there. So what's that? Done in 1995, Andy, and we're in 2022, and it's still the record from a structure in a movie. So that's very impressive.
I would have thought that would have been beaten by now, but it's a pretty high bar to beat, isn't it?
It is, yes. So the audience can't see Bond's face clearly at first, and you are teased by camera shots of the side of Bond's face. You also kind of get a shadowy silhouette view of Bond as well, so you kind of get some of the sides, some of the back. As he's running on top of the dam, you can't really see any of his facial features. This reminded me of how Jules Lazenby was introduced in On Her Majesty's Secret Service as well, how they teased the new Bond as well. So I thought that was quite good. I like that little build-up. I also, well, you know, we both, well, I think I'm going to say we both, Andy. So I'm going to say I think this is the strongest entrance of a new Bond so far in the franchise. I don't know if you do.
Yeah, I agree. So far, by far, it's not even close. This is a fantastic entrance for Bond. A very, very powerful way to introduce the new character. The new actor, sorry.
And when you think about it, Brosnan isn't even really seen at this point in time. It's the stuntman. But yeah, very strong entrance. So they go and break a record that's still standing as well. It's a brilliant bit of action sequence as well. So it's definitely the strongest so far. So getting back into the movie, Bond infiltrates the complex and knocks out a guy sitting in the toilet. And then we see Bond meet up with 006, and there's a bit of banter between 007 and 006. And the note we made here was, they seem to be more than friends than just colleagues.
Yeah, they're definitely not just workmates, are they? There seems to be a personal connection there. My favourite exchange between the two was when they first laid eyes on each other, and 006 says, "You're late, 007," to which Bond responds, "I had to stop in the bathroom." And I thought that really set the tone for not only their interaction, but also for Brosnan, you know, having the witty one-liners. 006 is played by English actor Sean Bean. You may know Sean Bean from a range of movie and TV roles, including Lord of the Rings, Sharp, Snowpiercer, or Game of Thrones, amongst many, many others. And interesting tidbit, Sean Bean actually auditioned for the role of Bond in The Living Daylights.
Also, Sean Bean announced in 2019 that he won't take on any roles where he's killed off. He's died on screen a whopping 23 times. So there are some funny memes online about this, including YOLOs, which stands for You Only Live One Season. Now, I've watched a lot of Sean Bean's films and TV roles, and he does die a lot, but I never really realised he had died 23 times, which is a massive number, really.
Certainly sounds it, doesn't it? And I certainly remember a few of those, namely Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. They're the two that stand out.
Anyway, so 006 was originally written as an older character that would have been kind of more of a mentor to Bond. And Anthony Hopkins and Alan Rickman were reportedly approached for this role, but they both turned it down. So that meant the script was rewritten and 006 was made younger, so more of a peer to Bond than kind of a mentor, really. And so we're still in the opening scene of GoldenEye, and Bond has used his famous one-liners several times already. I don't even know we're 10 minutes into this, Andy, and it just felt like there's too many one-liners already. And it just feels like that they're playing kind of catch-up. So we've had 6-year hiatus, and we're kind of playing catch-up with the Bond one-liners.
Yeah, I agree with that. It felt like they were coming thick and fast, and after a few, it's kind of like, yeah, we get the point. You're a funny guy. Now I'll move on. But whilst they're in there, they've also got serious work to do, even though they're obviously being quite jovial. Bond and 006 intend to blow up the complex. They break into a room to plant the bombs. 006 provides cover for Bond while he plants them, but he's captured by General Urumov. At this point, 006 shouts to Bond, "Finish the job." Bond resets the 6-minute timers to 3 minutes. He walks out to surrender, but Urumov shoots 006 in the head. Rest in peace, Alec Trevelyan. And rest in peace, Sean Bean. It's another one he's died in, and they've not taken very long to do it this time.
Bond manages to escape the room by using a conveyor belt and shooting the locks on the barrels overhead. So the barrel's gone flying down and hits all the guards. And Bond tries to escape via a plane that is taken off. However, Bond and the pilot fall out of the plane, but Bond manages to use the motorbike to chase the empty plane. And this is the bit where Andy mentioned about the gloves. No, yes it is. Yeah, that's the bit with the gloves. And the plane goes over the runway and goes over the cliff, and you see Brosnan on his motorbike fly over. So this is a very cool scene as well. And then you see Bond regain control of the plane, and then as it's flying over, the Russian base explodes, which I think this is one of the few times in this movie where I felt the special effects looked a bit dated here.
Yeah, it was a pretty cool looking scene, I have to agree. we're going to get into the science portion of the show now, because this made no sense to me whatsoever in terms of logic. So bear with me. Bond is falling towards the plane. So he's chasing the plane. The plane goes off the cliff. He's chased on the motorbike. He goes off the cliff, jumps off the motorbike. He's falling. The plane is falling ahead of him. My basic understanding of science, and it may or may not be correct, is that the laws of gravity suggest that they would fall at the same speed. So therefore, there's no way for Bond to catch up to the plane. So how does he do it? That it bothers me, keeps me up at night. And I don't know if it's me going mad, I don't know if it's my basic science knowledge has failed me, or whether it was just one of those things that has been completely overlooked in the film.
It's an interesting, Andy, and I know I keep saying interesting, you keep saying interesting, and we said previously on a previous episode that my wife says we say interesting too much, so we need to come up with a different word, Andy. But it is interesting that you say this, because when this happened, the wife turned to me and said they would fall at the same rate. They wouldn't, Bond wouldn't be able to catch up the plane. Now, I didn't write that down because I just thought she was just saying something, and it wasn't I disagreed with her, but I thought that's an interesting point. However, science isn't our strong subject, so it's interesting that you and I picked that up. But I've Googled this, Andy, and in short, you are correct. I mean, someone has posted something on the Physics Stack Exchange and included like the formula as well about gravity, force, and mass, and the scientific reason why basically you are correct. If there's two objects that weigh different, they will basically hit the ground at the same time. But for this podcast, Andy, I'm not going to read out all the scientific blurb there, and I'm not going to read out the formula. But if any listeners want to go away and research that, feel free to send us any, the simplified, explain like I'm 5-year-old kind of explanation to this to me and Andy can pick it up on the social medias. But no, in short, Andy, you're right.
Homework for the listeners, pay attention, class. Tell us about the science behind my point and either prove me right or prove me wrong. You've got 1 week to do it, and your time starts now. But let's get back to the film. So from this opening scene, which was a pretty cool scene, has to be said, despite the lack of science, we're going to the music. As stated earlier, Tina Turner sings the GoldenEye theme song. It was actually written by Bono and the Edge from U2, and my first thought when I saw that piece of information was, thank goodness they didn't sing it. Not a fan at all. Sorry, Bono and the Edge, you just don't do it for me. So it's Tina Turner, and I thought she did a great job, which we'll get onto the song later. The film producers didn't work with Bono or the Edge during the production of GoldenEye, and therefore we didn't hear any of the theme song melodies in the film, which has been the case in previous movies of the franchise. So there's a little bit of a departure from the norm. The producers did approach and make an offer to John Barry, but Barry turned them down. Therefore, the soundtrack was composed and performed by French composer Eric Serra. Serra has previously composed the scores for Leon and Nikita.
It's interesting, Andy, because I noticed that, in the other films in the franchise, you kind of hear the melodies, don't you, playing throughout the film, and I definitely noticed that wasn't evident in GoldenEye. The GoldenEye score was received negatively and attracted some criticism from people, including the director Martin Campbell, who expressed his disappointment. Apparently, Serra was Oh my! This is exactly what happened last week. And you know what? Last night I was not practicing, but I remembered this and I said it perfectly. And then I think I better mess it up when I do record. Uncooperative. So who's editing this one? Which one's this?
This one's going to be mine. It's going to be a long night when I'm doing this one, isn't it?
Apparently, Serra wasn't happy and he didn't want to work and rescore the tank chase scene after Campbell rejected the track. This led to John Altman providing the music for the tank chase scene as well. Now, kind of just touching on Tina Turner. So she, as I said, she's the queen of rock and roll. And Tina Turner is one of the best-selling female artists of all time with 100 million record sales, which is very impressive. To be fair, Andy, they don't get many duds in the music, in the theme songs, do they? You don't have many. Well, there's probably no unknowns that have done the soundtracks. But carrying on, the GoldenEye single peaked at number 10 in the UK, but didn't feature in the top 100 of the US Billboard charts. However, it did peak at 89 in the US R&B and hip hop chart, which I was very surprised that the single didn't do very well, because I think it's a strong entry in the franchise, and we're going to obviously talk about where the song ranks later on in our, at the end of the podcast. But I don't think it's a weak song at all. I think it's a very good song, and it surprised me it didn't make the top 100 in the US Billboard chart.
Yeah, I was a bit surprised by that as well. I'd say it's a pretty strong song. It did surprise me when I read that it peaked at 89 in the R&B and hip hop chart, because my ignorance of music suggests to me that this is not an R&B or a hip hop song. But if that's what it's classed as, then I guess that makes sense. But yeah, I don't think GoldenEye by Tina Turner when I think R&B and hip hop.
No, and I'm just looking at the Billboard 100 singles of 1995, and there's some classics there, Andy. You got Gangster's Paradise by Coolio featuring LV was number 1. Waterfalls was number 2 by TLC. Creep was number 3 by TLC as well. You got Kiss from a Rose by Seal. You got some bangers there.
Keep some good company then. So maybe there is a reason. Maybe it was just a banner year for music, 1995, and unfortunately GoldenEye was left behind as a result.
Andy, you love this. In number 81, U2. Hold Me, Thrill Me, Kiss Me, Kill Me, which is a Batman song, is that right?
Batman song. I'll give them the due. It's a decent song. I'm a big fan of the Batman films. That was a good effort, but still, I don't forgive you, Bono, for the crimes you've perpetrated against music.
And one last thing for me, Andy. At number 93, the classic, I remember this growing up, Cotton Eye Joe by Redneck.
Staple of every kid's party. Love it. Okay, let's move on with the film, shall we? Rather than talking kids' party songs, otherwise we could be here all day. I'm a big fan. We're next off to Monaco, and it's 9 years later. Bond is driving an Aston Martin DB5 with Caroline. Caroline is a psychological and psychiatric evaluator, easy for me to say, played by British actress Serena Gordon. So Gordon has the honour of playing the first Bond girl of the Brosnan era. Now, the geek in me noticed a little detail on the DB5, and that was the number plate. So Goldfinger, the number plate was BMT 216A, as it was in subsequent Daniel Craig films, because he brings that car back. In GoldenEye, it's BMT 214A. So very similar. So that would suggest it came from the same production line. So I don't know if MI6 have just got a whole line of Aston Martin DB5s, or whether it's just a coincidence.
How do you notice those things in terms of car registration numbers? Is there just something like you just remember, or do you have in your real life you just kind of remember these kind of things? Do you remember what my one is? Don't tell any of the listeners, but is that something you just remember, or are these ones just have some kind of meaning to you?
No meaning. I'm just a very lonely man. No, to be honest, I remember the memory of the Goldfinger one is more that when it appeared in Skyfall, it was kind of like, hang on a minute, that's the same car from Goldfinger, and so it's just kind of stuck with me from then. And I don't know, it's just one of those things that I remember. I remember things that are probably not worth remembering sometimes. It's a blessing and a curse.
It is, Andy. It's well remembered, though. So we've got a 9-year time jump, as Andy mentioned, and this definitely felt significant. And I don't recall any time in the franchise so far of us having a time jump. And as part of the research, we found that Michael G. Wilson stated a few days before GoldenEye was actually released that the Bond films were not a one big film series, but rather a series of series, which was interesting because obviously we've had instances in the past where a new actor has taken over, say for example Jules Lazenby, And we've kind of had little throwbacks. So in Her Majesty's Secret Service, where Lazenby is in his office, he is in. You could see some bits in there that was from different films. So you had the Gold Sovereigns from Russia with Love. You had something to do with Honey Rider. I can't quite remember, but from Doctor No. But there were little throwbacks, and obviously we've had throughout, in Timothy Dalton, in Roger Moore as well, in Connery, the throwback about Bond being married as well. So up until this point, it definitely felt like it was one series and not necessarily a series of series. Getting back to the film, we see a good-looking woman driving a Ferrari, and she's later introduced as Dina Onatop, played by Famke Janssen.
Yeah, Famke Janssen was a professional fashion model, and she'd appeared in 3 films before being cast in GoldenEye. She would go on to play various roles, including Jean Grey in the X-Men film series. She was in Taken with Liam Neeson, as well as shows such as Nip Tuck, Hemlock Grove, and The Blacklist.
And a wife commented here that Janssen looks quite older in this movie compared to her later roles in films like X-Men and Taken, which I think I agree, but she looked very pale in GoldenEye, and I don't know that's because she came from Russia, so they were kind of doing the not sun-kissed kind of Bond girl there, but she could have played a vampire in terms of how pale her skin looked in this. But we see Bond and Onatop have a little race, and Caroline is kind of stressing out. She's proclaiming how reckless Bond is, and Bond finally agrees to stop and kind of does his handbrake, and he then shows Caroline a bottle of Bollinger as well that he's got stored in the car. And this whole scene in terms of Brosnan is very smooth with Caroline, and this definitely sets the tone for the Brosnan era with how he interacts with the Bond girls. And later on we see Bond arriving at the casino, and he spots a red Ferrari outside that Onatop was driving, and he clocks that Onatop is playing a card game and she seems to be winning, but Bond joins the table and shortly beats Onatop, who seems to be a very bad loser, and she kind of doesn't take it well. She storms off as well.
Yeah, her mood changed quite quickly here. Bond followed her, they introduced themselves to each other, and Bond seems to be quite taken by Onatop's name, and they have a little bit of a flirt. We get the James Bond introduction at this point. The card game that you mentioned was Baccarat, which we've seen in the past. He has a vodka martini. We're getting all the classics here. So, we've got a tick list of Bond items, and he's rattling through them quite quickly at this point. A little bit later on, we see Bond using the digital binoculars and camera to observe Onatop leaving the casino with the Admiral. Later on, Bond sneaks onto the yacht and finds the Admiral's corpse. Now, I made a note about the scene where the Admiral is killed by Onatop. I guess you'd call it a sex/murder scene. And I thought it was quite graphic in comparison to previous Bond films. I've always felt that in the past there was the implication of sex, not necessarily the showing of said. That would make this the first actual sex scene shown in a Bond film.
And it's a very rough sex scene as well, Andy. And let me check, Andy. Sorry, I'm going to quickly check to see what the age rating of this film was, because like you said, it's the first film in a franchise that has a sex scene, so I'm going to do on-the-fly research here.
My guess is it would be a 15, and according to the BBFC, so that would be the UK rating. I don't know what the US equivalent would be. Maybe PG-13.
It's a 15 in the UK. Interesting. When you go to Common Sense Media, which is a good website, I've used that in the past. Parents say age 13 plus, and kids say age 13 plus. And they picked out the sex, romance, and nudity at 3 out of 5, violence at 3 out of 5, drinks, drugs, and smoking. So all the staples of a good movie. So carrying on, we got the Eurocopter, and it's stolen by Onatop and someone else, and you can't see whose face it is at present. And they kind of give a little wave to the audience as they walk into the copter as well. And as Andy mentioned at the beginning, the score is very different to the usual Bond soundtracks here, and it's really noticeable.
Yeah, Bond is definitely in the 90s now, isn't he? We move on to the satellite base in Siberia, and it's at this point we're introduced to Natalia and Boris, both of whom are computer programmers.
Yeah, and soon as this happened, the wife remembered the bit that, Boris's kind of catchphrase, "Yes, I'm invincible," which isn't a Russian accent and all, but I can't do accents, so forgive me. And I don't think it's this bit that he says that. I think it's near the end. But as soon as Boris came on, the wife quoted, "Yes, I'm invincible."
Yeah, that is a quote from later in the film, so well remembered. I like Boris at this point. He's a bit childish, a bit perverted, uses a lot of innuendo. And there's a part where he's clearly setting the passwords for something for Natalia to use, and he sets the password to knockers. I mean, that's just childish. But I thought it was quite amusing.
Talking about passwords, do you without giving your password away, do you have a type of password that you use? Because I used to use a password from Dexter that was in there that his sister says, and I used it once because this website that basically kept saying, it kept failing, like, you need to use a capital, you need to use lowercase, you need to do a special, you need to do a number, and it's like a swear word that she uses in the Dexter episode. And I remembered that and I used it. But I'm just thinking, when I have to change my password next time, I might kind of keep to the Boris kind of logic now. Some rude words.
That'll be a good one to explain to your IT department, won't it?
I think that's why I changed the Dexter one in the end, just in case I had to, repeat it.
That's a good point. No. To answer your question, I tend to try not to have the same password for everything, if I can. I have been hacked once or twice on things like social media and attempted hacking on my bank account, but which was failed. But it's kind of made me a little bit nervous since then. But anyway, the Eurocopter, the stolen Eurocopter that you mentioned earlier, arrives, and Onatop and General Urumov get off the Eurocopter. Urumov orders the base commander to hand over the activation keys and the control disk. And then Onatop seemingly kills everyone at the base, and she really enjoys it. And I mean, like, she really, really enjoys it. She's getting off on it, isn't she, basically?
Yeah, so there's 2 points here, Andy. I think she probably doesn't even get paid. I think she just does the job because she loves it. So she's not getting paid by General Oromov. I think she just does it for free. But when this was happening, it reminded me of Max Zorin in the earlier Bond films, where he's in the big mines and it's all getting flooded and he's just taking the guns to all his kind of goons, workers, and just ploughing them all down and laughing. That just reminded me of that scene. Yeah,
I completely agree. A View to a Kill is one you're thinking of from 85.
So I was 4 years old then. So moving on, General Oromov and Onatop arm GoldenEye, and there's still time for Onatop to pull out a one-liner. And as stated, this movie is really heavy with one-liners, and she says something like, I didn't write it down, but she says something like, "I had to vent someone," or "someone had to be vented." So even Onatop, even the henchmen women are getting involved with the one-liners. So the next few scenes flick between MI6 Siberia and MI6 again. So we now meet the new Miss Moneypenny for the first time, and we get the usual banter between Moneypenny and Bond. But Moneypenny definitely seems more empowered, and she says something along the lines that this type of behaviour could warrant sexual harassment.
Yeah, the dynamic between the two is really good here. They're flirtatious with each other, but Moneypenny gives as good as she gets. She's not in the submissive role that maybe Lois Maxwell and Caroline Bliss played. She seems to be on a par. This Miss Moneypenny is played by Samantha Bond. She's the third actress to play Miss Moneypenny in the franchise, and she would play the role in 4 Bond movies, all 4 of the Brosnan ones.
Yeah, so Bond and Bill Tanner are having a discussion, and Tanner has a dig at M about the intel that they had, but M didn't act on it. So unfortunately for Tanner, M overhears him, and Bill Tanner returns to the franchise. So when Bond is liaising and talking to Tanner. I thought that rings a bell, Tanner. And he has previously featured in The Man with a Golden Gun, but he was uncredited in that role. And he appears in For Your Eyes Only. So Tanner is played by Michael Kitchen in GoldenEye, whose most famous role is Detective Chief Superintendent Christopher Foyle in Foyle's War. I've never watched that, so if any listeners have, let us know what it's like.
Yep, me neither. Let's move on. M's around. She has a bit of a dig at the American government. Something about them finding information from a news channel, which I thought was quite witty and probably quite appropriate given recent events as well. M, played by Dame Judi Dench, so the first female M, and Dame Judi Dench would appear in 8 Bond movies in total, including Spectre, where she's seen on videotape. We'll talk a bit more about M as we go along, but that's a good thing to note that she appears in 8 Bond movies. Bear in mind that Brosnan's only in 4, so there's a teaser for future episodes.
Definitely. So in Siberia, we see the satellite base get destroyed by the EMP beam from orbit. All the electrical equipment is destroyed, along with the 3 fighter planes that were dispatched to the base. So an observation here by the wife. So Natalia's hair was fine before she jumped to avoid the roof falling in, but as she's jumped and gets up, she has this crazy kind of bed hair afterwards. So just a point there from the missus. Back at MI6, they witnessed the disruption of images and the electronics in the region resulting from the GoldenEye EMP blast. And you can see that the screens at MI6 have all suffered a blackout as well. But then when the screens come back on, Bond spots a survivor walking away from the base with the, I don't know, would you say infrared? I'm not quite sure, but he notices it as well.
Yeah, this was a really good scene, I thought. We mentioned the dated special effects earlier, but I thought actually this scene was easily the best use of special effects so far, in not just the film, but in the entire franchise. Very impressive. M and Bond are discussing the situation. This is the scene I mentioned earlier, where I gave kind of a close second in terms of my favourite scene. They clash. M has the sense that Bond doesn't really trust her judgment. She tells him he's a sexist, misogynist dinosaur and a relic of the Cold War. And for me, this whole interaction between the two was a very, very powerful scene. I think it really sets the tone for who M is, but also I see it as almost a line in the sand to separate the old-fashioned attitudes of previous Bond films from present and future Bond films, and what they are and what they need to be. What were your thoughts on this, Jay? I really love this scene.
Yeah, I agree, Andy. There's always been an interaction, hasn't there, between Bond and M, with the previous actors. But she was very, like you said, she doesn't kind of condone or tolerate his behavior or how he interacts. But I agree, it was very powerful scene. And there's obviously this bit that you mentioned, which is one of your favorite scenes, and then later on in the film, isn't it, where they're talking in the back of a car as well, where she says something like she wouldn't hesitate sending him to his death or something like that, doesn't she? So she's very formidable character and obviously in charge as well. So she's not someone to be messed around with. But I've got a question, Andy, after your question to me. So Brosnan's Bond has waited 9 years since 006 was killed by General Oromov. Do you think Dalton's Bond would have waited this long? Because obviously in License to Kill, he obviously handed in his license and went on the revenge mission to, get payback for Felix Leiter and his wife when they were killed / injured.
Yeah, Dalton played, I would say, a more emotional version of Bond. Took things a little bit personally, whereas Brosnan, at least up to this point, is very much mission oriented. It has to be said. There's no real flicker of what makes him happy or sad. He's just very straight laced. Whereas Dalton, I thought, was quite emotional. So I don't think he would have waited 9 years at all. I think he'd have gone straight for the revenge plot as soon as it had happened.
Yeah, I agree. And I suppose was Brosnan just playing it safe? You know, this was at the height of the Cold War. Last thing he wants is to bring the UK into a war with the Soviet Union, so he's playing it safe there. But moving on, so we're in St. Petersburg now, and Oromov has a meeting with the Russian Defense Council. Oromov gives an update on his investigation, and then he offers to resign. However, the defense minister states that there were 2 missing survivors, which surprises Oromov, because we obviously find out later on Boris is working for General Oromov, and he wasn't aware of the other missing survivor, so he carries on with his investigation. And we flip back to MI6 now, and we meet Q for the first time in the movie. But it looks like Q's injured, so he's in his wheelchair with his leg cast, but we don't have to worry about it. It's just a rocket launcher disguised as a leg cast. So Q is fine.
Yeah, Q in typical mood here, I think. I quite like the fact that he's in a wheelchair and it's a gadget. Speaking of gadgets, Bond gets a new car at this point. It's the first BMW of the franchise, a BMW Z3, and it's got all the usual Q branch modcons, Stinger missiles, ejector seat, an all-points radar, amongst other things. So, but, you know, Q's been busy creating various toys. Randomly, we find out that Bond has a 34-inch waist, and that's linked to the belt gadgets. And in the background, there's other gadgets sort of being tested and played with, including a phone box with an inflatable kind of airbag or balloon type thing in it, which was quite amusing.
Yeah, I like this bit, Andy, because you see the next bit where Bond is talking to Q, and then you see one of the people in Q branch wheel away this phone box, but you can still see the man kind of like his hands out, just flattened in the phone box still. So I thought that was quite funny. And then I think we're probably, I don't know if you say if it's an iconic scene or not, but it's definitely one that a lot of people kind of can, when you ask them about a Bond franchise or kind of like the comedy bits, a lot of people will mention this. And this is a bit where Bond kind of picks up the baguette, but then Q takes it off of him because it turns out to be Q's lunch.
Yeah, that was quite amusing, I thought. I think this whole scene showed quite a different dynamic between Bond and Q. I think it's more friendly, more light-hearted than we've seen previously. I think I've mentioned in the past that there's almost like a teacher-pupil type mentality, and I think Q gets a bit irritated by Bond and his childish ways or not paying attention, whereas this seemed to be a lot more jovial and friendly between each other. So it was quite a good dynamic. I liked it. We're back in St. Petersburg next, and we see Joe Don Baker makes a return. He previously played Brad Whitaker in The Living Daylights.
So as Andy mentioned in previous podcast episodes, the producers do like to recycle the actors, and he's come back. I always find it a bit weird though when they use an actor that has a major part in a film and then they come back to do another role. You can kind of understand a small supporting role maybe coming back, but you know, he played Brad Whitaker, who was one of the villains in The Living Daylights, and now he's the CIA contact, Jack Wade. So I always find that a bit strange. Not like there's not many actors out there, Andy, is there? So as Andy said, Joe Don Baker returns, and he's playing CIA contact Jack Wade, who drives a very small blue car, and he says something along the lines that, you know, the car's never let him down. But then, you know, later on, obviously, we see that car has broken down. And during this initial scene, Bond demands to see Wade's tattoo, which he does do in the end, after being convinced by Bond with a gun. And then when the car's broken down, this was a little funny bit where Wade is asking for a number of tools that Bond gives him, and then he says basically, just pass me the sledgehammer, and then he just whacks the engine to restart the motor. So I thought that was a little funny bit.
Yeah, there's a bit of comic relief there. One question that we've not noted down, but we've got, you know, Jack Wade from the CIA. Would this have been the perfect opportunity to bring in Felix Leiter, who we've seen in previous films? Surely Felix Leiter would be perfect for this kind of role.
I agree, Andy, but I wonder, you know, because he's missing a leg, I wonder that's why they kind of not had him in. It's just a thought.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, I've not thought of that. But going back to the earlier point about this being a series of series, it could have worked. But
They could have done, because we've said M is new, Moneypenny's new, obviously Q's the same. So Bill Tanner's different. So they've introduced kind of like a soft reboot, haven't they?
Yeah, they have. They've gone upgrade. They've not replaced the software entirely, but they have done a pretty sizable upgrade, I would say, at this point. Another character though that we see is former KGB agent Zukovsky. Zukovsky's played by Robbie Coltrane, famous Scottish actor, featured in various films and TV shows, including Harry Potter, Cracker, and National Treasure, amongst other things. Zukovsky, not particularly happy to see Bond. Bond explained to Wade a little earlier that he was the one that gave him a limp and stole his woman.
And we see Zukovsky's mistress in this one, and she's played by Minnie Driver, who's obviously a famous actress. And we picked this out as soon as Minnie Driver is singing here, really badly singing in a nightclub. Me and the missus said, "Oh, that's Minnie Driver." But I got the name wrong, because I said to her like Minnie Rogers, but I knew who I meant. Bond mocks the singer, not realising it's Zukovsky's mistress. And, that means Zukovsky doesn't take it happy, and he threatens Bond, and he shoots the seat a few times as well in this scene. But in the end, Bond and Zukovsky make a deal, and Zukovsky agrees to set up a meeting with Yanis and Bond.
Yeah, we then see Bond in a steam room, and he's attacked by Onatop and a goon. Bond eventually overcomes them both. I believe your wife had a comment here about Onatop being like a wild animal. This was one of the scenes I talked about earlier when I mentioned the death grip, because she attempts this on Bond. And the filming of this scene was actually quite physical. Famke Janssen suffered a broken rib during the scene when Brosnan slammed her against the wall. Janssen wanted Brosnan to be more physical and make it look more realistic, and boy did he deliver.
Yep, and obviously Brosnan doesn't use a stunt double for this scene, Andy, does he? And I don't blame him for that. But Onatop drives Bond to the meeting place with Yanis, and Bond is very smug in the back seat here. He's got one up on Onatop, and he does this kind of karate chop to the back of her neck and knocks her out. And then we have the big reveal. So Yanis is in fact Alec, aka 006, and you hear the very English "Hello James" come from the shadows when he reveals himself to Bond. And I can't, even though I'm English, I couldn't really do a fake English accent there, Andy.
Yeah, this is like a really proper posh English accent, and we are not really proper posh English gentlemen, has to be said. But I thought this reveal was tremendous. They're having a bit of back and forth. Obviously, Bond is seemingly stunned at the revelation that Alex has betrayed him. And as they're talking, Alec makes mention of how Bond's parents died, something to do with a climbing accident. And it got me thinking, is this the first mention of Bond's parents and their deaths?
I can't remember it being mentioned, but my memory's not the best, Andy, so I couldn't say 100%, but it's interesting that you picked that up, because I don't recall it being mentioned, but I couldn't say 100%. But it also kind of re-emphasizes the point that they're not just work colleagues. Bond's obviously spoken at some point about his parents' death.
Yeah, clearly a previous friendship exists there. It just got me thinking, because I know the parents are not necessarily integral to the Bond backstory, but it kind of put me in mind of a young Bruce Wayne and the death of his parents, and that led to him becoming Batman. And I just wondered whether the parents' death led to Bond becoming what he became. Who knows? But an interesting little tidbit nonetheless.
Oh, you could say, Andy, about parents' deaths. Harry Potter as well lost both his parents when he was a baby. So Harry Potter could have turned out to be a spy and not a wizard, or even Luke Skywalker as well. It's a common theme, isn't it, in like some films about the hero? But yes, it's a valid point.
It is. You've got to suffer personal tragedy in order to overcome in the end, I guess. It's kind of an unwritten rule of Hollywood. Just as long as we don't get Daniel Radcliffe playing James Bond, that would be the end for me.
You never know, they could reboot it. And it could be, instead of like Hogwarts, it could be when he goes to Oxford to do Oriental studies and stuff.
Yeah, it could, but not Daniel Radcliffe, please. Please, not Daniel Radcliffe. No offence, Daniel, but you were terrible in the first 2 Harry Potter films, and that made me not want to see any more of them. Just one man's opinion. But anyway, this scene ends with Bond being hit with a dart gun, and then he wakes up in the stolen helicopter with Natalia. They're both tied up, but they manage to escape. Bond headbutts the control panel because his arms are tied, and that pulls the ejector seats, and also they end up flying out in the capsule. So all's well that ends well.
And Bond and Natalia are caught by the Russian authorities and are being interrogated by the defense minister before General Oromov arrives, and he's very flustered as well. And he ends up killing the guard and the minister to protect his secret that he's a double agent. Bond and Natalia manage to escape from the cell that they're being held in, and there's a bit of a chase scene here, but in the I don't know if it's an embassy or some kind of headquarters, but this leads on to the brilliant tank / car chase scene through the streets of St. Petersburg as well. And we get a bit of kind of like Fast and Furious drifting here. So we see, Bond drifting the tank around some corners as well. And then I thought this was quite funny as well. So General Oromov is sipping some alcohol from his hip flask as well, where he's being chased by this massive tank and he's in this little police vehicle as well. And I think that was quite funny. And there's also another bit, and I can't quite remember exactly where it is, but we see a bit where some of it happens and Bond then kind of straightens his tie, and I thought that was very smooth and quite funny as well. And then Bond eventually tracks General Oromov and Natalia down, and he manages to sneak onto the train as well. We see Alec, and he's just very, very smug as well. And the note I've made here, maybe it's a requirement for being an MI6 agent that you have to be really smug.
And it probably explains why the two of them were such great friends, because they're both a pair of intolerable, I can't say the word. Both a right pair of wankers. I might edit that out, I might not, we'll see. But I do have another science question, class. How did James Bond, in a tank, manage to not only chase down a fast-moving train, but he got ahead of it and was able to lie in wait? Has he got a really, really fast tank, or was it a really, really slow train? Again, this was another bit of the film that just didn't make logical sense to me.
And I didn't pick that up, Andy, to be honest. We see the tank in the opening of the tunnel, but I didn't kind of clock on how quick. So yeah, Andy, like you said, another question for the audience. Answers on a postcard or social media, send it in.
Yeah, so if a train leaves the station travelling at X miles an hour, and a tank is chasing it at Y miles an hour, how did Bond get onto the train? I've just done a quick Google search of tank top speed, and the first thing that comes up is from wanderopolis.org. Yep, I've not heard of it either. 25 miles an hour on flat terrain is the top speed, or up to 45 miles per hour on roads. That seems very slow compared to a train.
Yeah, that train must have been going very slow. Very slow. Maybe it's a very old, although it does look modern,
It does. It's kitted out quite nicely, isn't it, on the inside? I wonder if maybe they had to stop for engineering works along the way, or maybe get off and take a replacement bus at some point before they got back on. But anyway, another point here. Sean Bean obviously plays 006, and 006 is not happy when Bond is there. But Sean Bean doesn't maintain his posh accent when he's angry. He went full Yorkshire. So Sean Bean is an actor from Sheffield, for those unaware. And he shouts, and I'm going to butcher the South Yorkshire accent here, but he shouts, "Full speed, ram him!" And there's a it happens later on in the film too when he gets angry and again his Yorkshire accent slips out.
I work in South Yorkshire, which is, Sheffield's part of it, Andy, and it just felt like I was back at work there, Andy, when you was, doing that accent. Very well done there. But Bond shoots Aramov, but Alex manages to escape with Onatop. Alec locks the train, trapping Bond and Natalia inside, and tells Bond that he's planted explosives on the train with timers set for the same 6 minutes that Bond gave him years before, which obviously means 3 minutes. And I like that little kind of throwback there. So they escape in the end in the helicopter. That is Alec and Onatop. But we see Bond cuts the floor with his laser watch that Andy mentioned at the top of the podcast, one of his gadgets from Q, while Natalia is trying to break Boris's riddle password, which she does with the help of Bond, and Natalia manages to track Boris's location somewhere in Havana, Cuba.
Yeah, I made a note at this point around the riddle password that Boris had set, because he mentioned this riddle earlier on in the film, and I don't have it word for word, but it was something along the lines of, what do you sit on but you can't take with you? And she was trying various words like butt and arse, I think, but the answer is obviously chair. And I thought that straight away as soon as Boris said it earlier in the film. It's obviously chair. Natalia is a computer programmer, so obviously a very, very smart woman, but she didn't know that riddle. What am I missing here?
Yeah, I'm assuming programmers are very logical, and I think that's quite a logical riddle, which riddles tend to be. And I got it straight away, but then Andy, I started doubting myself, thinking, did I just remember when I watched this years ago? But my memory is really poor, so I don't think I would have done. But yeah, I thought it was a really obvious one. But moving on, as I mentioned, Natalia has found that Boris is in Havana somewhere. So we're now in Cuba, and Bond and Natalia are enjoying the beaches in Cuba. And we get some kind of romantic shots as well. And the wife commented here that Natalia looks like Honey Rider in a bikini, and that's the bit where Bond is on the beach and you see Natalia walking to him, and she's like kind of rocking a bikini. So I thought that was a nice little throwback to the first Bond film.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's a good spot. I made a note about this as well. So as you mentioned, Natalia approaches Bond when he's sat on the beach. He's clearly deep in thought, and I mentioned earlier that Brosnan had kind of played Bond straight-laced and not really showing any kind of emotion. But for this particular scene, I thought this was maybe the first glimpse of emotion, of more of a human side of Bond. And I wonder if this was him kind of reflecting on Alec's betrayal, and maybe he was showing that he was actually hurt by it personally, not just from a work perspective.
I think this is one of the few times that Bond is a bit self-aware in terms of like the actions, and obviously people have died, and he lost 006 all those years ago, and it must have been on the back of his mind throughout these last 9 years. But yeah, you definitely get that glimpse, like you said, of Bond. And this is obviously Brosnan's first film, so he's kind of set it straight away, hasn't he, in terms of showing a bit of thought to self-awareness as well. But carrying on, and we didn't mention this at the beginning of the pod, but we mentioned it off microphone. Our notes during this second half of the film, especially this last third, actually drop off quite a lot. So I've just noticed, actually, Andy, we're quite near the end, and I don't feel like we've spoken much about this, the last few scenes. So Bond's plane is shot down by a missile from under the lake. So this is the bit. So Bond has already met Jack Wade. They've got a plane, and they're scoping out where this hidden satellite is. And this is the bit where Bond's plane is shot down by the missile from under the lake. And this is another throwback as well. So there's a few times during this film where you kind of think of earlier Bonds, and this one made me think of the hidden base in You Only Live Twice.
Yeah, I completely agree. It was a nice callback, I thought. And to your earlier point, you're absolutely right about our note-taking or lack thereof. What I would advise the listeners is just go ahead and watch the film. There's a lot going off in this film. Mostly good, some a little bit questionable, but I think it just shows how much we were into the film because we were just paying attention to it. Well, not so much paying attention from a note-taking perspective, but just kind of immersed into it. I think it was really what made the film strong for me, is that we were so involved. But let's go over some of the final bits as we speed towards the end. So Bond is awakened by a helicopter flying overhead. Onatop repels down from the helicopter and she attacks Bond. And she tries her death grip, the squeezing of Bond with her legs, but Bond's able to rehook her restraints back to the helicopter. So it was quite a nice move.
Yeah, and just a quick comment here from the wife to say that Jansen looks very old and haggard in this film, which I thought was a bit harsh, but she definitely looks older, like we said earlier on, and she does look a bit haggard. But yes, she is obviously very beautiful, but this film doesn't do her justice.
So at this point, we see the satellite dish rise from under the lake, and Bond and Natalia slide down the concrete to avoid being shot. And we're kind of skipping over, but we get into the climax here, and we're getting the big fight scene at the end between Alec and Bond. And within the base, just a random note that I made, there are computer screens, and the lettering on there is absolutely huge. Like, someone with seriously poor eyesight is operating this machinery.
Andy, when I read your note on this, I thought I didn't notice that. So I Googled it and I found the bit where the computer screens are, and the font is just massive. And it reminds me of the wife. So during COVID, we've both been working from home, and I have my screen zoomed really far out because I like a lot of things on my screen at once. And I happened to walk past my wife when she was working, and she had an email up, and it was so zoomed in it looked like the font was something like 24, and it was like an email, so you only basically saw a few sentences in a screen, whereas I have it really zoomed out so I can see everything. So yeah, when you picked, I didn't notice that when I rewatched it, but like I said, I Googled it and it was quite funny where the massive font on there. So a question here is, Bond and Alec are fighting, as Andy mentioned, but Alec, why did he climb down the ladder? So Bond was hanging from the structure where the ladder is, and Alec climbs down there. Why do that? The sensible approach would be stay at the top. Bond's got to come up, so you're blocking the way. Why go down there and expose yourself? You could have stayed up the top. You could have got one of your goons to get you a gun or something and then kind of pick Bond off. It just didn't make sense there. But Bond gets the upper hand and he prevails, and he ends up dropping Alec from the ladder, which is, very cold, and obviously, must have... I wonder if it crossed his mind about keeping him alive and taking him in, to MI6 and capture him. But he drops him down the ladder, and this reminded me of which film was it? Where I think it's Sander, where he's holding him by his tie off the building, Roger Moore, and he kind of let him go. He's just a minor goon, minor villain, but we do mention him. I think his name's Sander. It's the one, with Jaws, and he's set in Egypt, I can't remember. But he kind of reminded me of that way. It's quite cold, it was. And anyway, so Alec falls down. He's still alive when he hits the bottom, but then the antenna collapses and lands on him and just squishes him.
Yeah, and that's the end of him, and then we get to the end of the film. So the final scene, Jay mentioned earlier, when all the Marines appear in the helicopters and stuff, felt a little bit flat to me. I don't know what your thoughts were, but I just thought flat's the word. If we think back to previous Bond films, Bond gets the girl, and I guess they live happily ever after, at least for a short period of time, if you know what I mean. But in this instance, they're just kind of like, I don't even know if they're having a kiss or if they're just talking. But then all the Marines appear, and then it just ends, and I don't know, just a bit of a nothing ending.
I agree, Andy, and I didn't write this down, but the wife said here, she made some kind of quip to say, it doesn't finish with Bond and the Bond girl in on a yacht or a dinghy or something, because they usually finish at sea, don't they, where they've done it. But yeah, it was a bit of a anticlimax. So yeah, it just finished there.
Yeah, an anticlimax in more ways than one.
The reading room.
Shall we leave it there and we'll move on to some one-liners and quotes from the film? So we mentioned earlier the interaction between Bond and Moneypenny, and there was a nice exchange here where Bond says, "Moneypenny, I'm devastated. Whatever would I do without you?" To which Moneypenny replies, "As far as I can remember, James, you've never had me."
Very good. I like that quote. So I've got one. So this is Bond pointing the gun at Sukowski's head, and Sukowski goes, "Waffer, PPK, 7.65 millimeter. Only 3 men I know use a gun. I believe I've killed 2 of them."
We get Q and Bond in Q Branch, and Q's showing Bond his new BMW. Q says, "Now I'm particularly..." No, he doesn't. Q says, "Now this I'm particularly proud of. Behind the headlights, Stinger missiles." Bond replies, "Excellent. Just the thing for unwinding after a rough day at the office." To which Q replies, "Need I remind you, 007, that you have a license to kill, not to break the traffic laws?" And Bond replies, "I wouldn't dream of it." Nice line though by Q.
Yeah, they've still got a bit of banter, haven't they, Q and James Bond? So that is the one-liners quote. So next section is the book versus movie. So although this is not based on a story by Ian Fleming, the title GoldenEye is based on Fleming's estate in Jamaica, where he wrote the Bond novels. And we've obviously mentioned, in earlier podcasts, some of the films obviously set in Jamaica as well. So, that's where they got the name for this film. However, there are some differences still between the book and the novelization based on the screenplay of GoldenEye. So this is just a minor point, but people that like cars, this could be an important point. Onatop drives a yellow Ferrari in Monte Carlo, not a red one, which is obviously seen in the movie.
Yeah, Bill Tanner as well has got a different title. It's revealed his title's changed by the new M from Chief of Staff to Senior Analyst, which is quite the demotion potentially. And another interesting point is that Urumov is killed by Alec Trevelyan, not by James Bond. So that's quite a significant difference there. So that's just a few book versus movie tidbits. Highlight of the podcast now coming up, Jay. Do you want to hear one of my world famous James Bond jokes?
Yes, I do. I want to hear it, and I'm sure the listeners do as well, Andy.
Prepare yourself. I say my James Bond jokes. You know what I mean. But did you know that in the James Bond movies, all the action scenes and the risky scenes were performed by Agent 0014? Of course, he was, after all, his double.
I like what you did there, Andy.
That's maths in everyday life there for you, as well as a joke. So it's funny and educational. You're welcome.
And we've obviously spoken about stunt doubles earlier on, so it is related to the pod. So nice one. And as always, if there's any people out there that has a Bond joke that we could use in a future episode, feel free to send it over to us. Now, Andy mentioned this, that's the joke was one of his favourite bits, and it moves us on to one of my favourite bits now, which is the quiz.
Are you ready? Let's start the quiz.
And this is the section where I will pose 4 statements to Andy, and 2 of these statements are correct and 2 of those are incorrect. As always, Andy, I'm going to say the 4 statements, and you can either tell me if they're incorrect straight away or wait until the end. So, are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do this.
Okay, and listeners, feel free to play at home as well. So, the first statement. James Bond doesn't smoke in GoldenEye because Pierce Brosnan is an ambassador for an anti-tobacco charity.
Yep, okay, hit me with statement 2.
The film features a Playboy contest winner from Be a Bond Girl competition. Next question, or next statement should I say. Pierce Brosnan injured his hand and the producers had to use a hand double for close-up shots. So not only he had stunt doubles, he had a hand double. And the last statement, Pierce Brosnan is an avid gamer, and the cast and crew would play GoldenEye N64 game during his tenure on the franchise. So, did Brosnan play GoldenEye during his tenure of the franchise? So, Andy, how do you want to do this?
Some interesting statements there. I'm going to rule out statement 3 straight away.
Okay.
For no other reason than as soon as you mentioned Brosnan needing a hand double, my immediate thought went to Friends when Joey is in Vegas and meets his hand twin. And I wonder if that's where you'd got that from. So I'm going to say that's incorrect.
Okay.
I can't imagine Brosnan being an avid gamer. So I'm going to say statement 4 is also incorrect. So by default, that means statements 1 and 2, I think, are correct. So he didn't smoke because of the anti-tobacco charity work, and the Be a Bond Girl competition winner got a part in the film. So I'm going to say they're true, and the other 2 are false.
So, Andy, I can tell you that you got 2 wrong and 2 right. So he's shaking his neck. He's not happy at all.
Unbelievable.
So
unbelievable.
I will go through I'm going to tell you, Andy, the 2 correct statements. Okay. So the film features a Playboy contestant winner from There Be a Bond Girl competition is an actual correct statement. So the lady that actually appears in GoldenEye won the competition years before, but because there was a time delay between the Timothy Dalton film and GoldenEye, she had to wait all that time. But she was in the scene where Onatop and Bond are playing cards in the casino. She stood up in the people watching. So that's the correct statement. The other correct statement is Pierce Brosnan injured his hand and the producers had to use his hand double. So interestingly, his son was the close-up hand model, and the hand model used was in like the car scenes and the laser pointer as well. So, in the train where he uses the laser bit to break down the bottom, they were hand doubles, and it was played, the hand was his boy. So that was interesting. So that meant the incorrect statements were Pierce Brosnan isn't an ambassador of the anti-tobacco charity. And as you said, he's not an avid gamer. Or, well, not as far as I'm aware, he's an avid gamer. So, Andy, unlucky this week.
I'm yet to score 0%, I believe, but I'm still not happy with 50. It's all or nothing for me.
Yes,
so, I won't sleep well tonight. I won't sleep well.
And when that hand double one, I thought the same as you about Friends, and I thought if I say that, he's potentially going to think of Joey, and that might throw him off the scent. So I'm happy there. So
well played.
Thank you. So that is the quiz, and now we're moving on to our last section.
The rating room.
So this is where we're going to go through each of the different areas that some of them we've mentioned already, but this is where we're going to actually see how they rank. So as Andy mentioned at the top of the podcast, GoldenEye runs for 2 hours 10 minutes, and as Andy mentioned, these are very similar times now, and a lot of the later films are always over the 2 hour mark. So GoldenEye comes in at the same time as Thunderball and The Living Daylights, so that is joint 5th. Now moving on to the kill count, and I mentioned at the top 47 kills, so I said that was a healthy number, and it is. It goes straight in at number 1 in terms of the kill count. And we're also tracking kills by actor as well, but obviously Brosnan's only done the 1 film, so his average is skewed, so it's 47 average, but he's got more kills already than Timothy Dalton, who got 23 across his 2 films. And George Lazenby obviously was only in 1, so he's only got 5 kills. So it'd be interesting to see how Brosnan does compared to Roger Moore, who's at the top at the moment with 90 kills. and Sean Connery is number 2 with 72 kills. So it'll be interesting to see how Brosnan gets on. And moving on to the last one before Andy talks over the next few bits was, as Andy mentioned earlier on, he does drink a martini. Well, sorry, Andy doesn't drink a martini as far as I'm aware. Bond drinks a martini. So that is 3 films in a row that he's drunk a martini. So let's see how he carries on.
It's Pepsi Max Raspberry for me, if you want to know my drink of choice. It's not a very Bond-esque drink though. But let's move on to the infamous James Bond introduction. Mentioned earlier, it was 19 minutes and 35 seconds. So we've had the introduction in 14 of the 17 films so far, and this would rank as the 8th quickest, so it's kind of mid-table. On the Hat Watch charts, we've got no throwing or wearing of a hat, and that's 3 movies in a row. So Dalton, for his two movies, was not interested in hats at all, and so far neither is Brosnan, which is interesting. And we mentioned earlier CIA agent Jack Wade instead of Felix Leiter. We have no Felix Leiter in this film. So we saw Leiter in the previous film, License to Kill, played by David Hedison, but no reappearance of Leiter in GoldenEye. And this is the one that really gets Jay's blood pumping, the box office figures. He loves the cash. So we mentioned the budget, $60 million, the largest budget so far. In terms of actual box office, $356.4 million is by far the biggest amount taken so far in the Bond franchise. But when we rank that for the adjusted box office based on today's rates, it's actually middle of the pack. Ranks 9 out of 17 so far at 672 million. So it's just slightly more than On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but quite a way behind from Russia with Love in 8th place.
Now, moving on to the Bond girls. So, as always, we're not going to list through all the Bond girls because we're up to 60 Bond girls now in the 17 films that we've had so far. So, I'm going to start from the bottom this time. So, I've slotted in Caroline at 55. So, that is just 1 below Linda from The Living Daylights and 1 above Log Cabin Girl in The Spy Who Loved Me. So just moving up now, who's going to be on top, Natalia or Xena on the top, and where are they going to drop into my rankings? Now, I've put Natalia in number 23, and she is just sandwiched between the Bond girls from the Timothy Dalton films. So that's between Pam, Lupe and Cara. So a bit of consistency there in terms of the 80s, 90s Bond girls. But where does Xena on the top go? So I do like on the top, and I think she is a strong Bond girl. But for me, as I say pretty much every week on this podcast, I work my way from top or bottom and then I slot them in. And for me, she is sandwiched between Kissy in You Only Live Twice and Stacey Sutton in A View to a Kill. She didn't break in my top 10, and I couldn't justify it. So, Andy, another thing I noticed as well when doing these rankings, I seem to favour the Bond girls from the early franchise. And when you look through my top 10, they're mostly, I'm just looking, appear in the Sean Connery films. Just looking through these, I've only got the odd one from, the odd few from the Roger Moore era. So I seem to favour the older ladies, but obviously, these ladies are all roughly the same age when they film. So yeah, Xena on the top at number 16, which I still think is respectable, but for me, she's not in the top 10. So she's below, Octopussy, Holly Goodhead, Jill Masterson, Sylvia Trench, all the classics as well. So yeah, how about you? Are you got similar rankings for the Bond girls as me?
So I'll start from the bottom as well. Caroline, very similar to you. I've got in her at 56 out of 60. Nothing really to say about Caroline. It was a short scene. She was quite submissive, didn't really do anything of note, so not a lot to say about her. I've also got Natalia in kind of second of the three, slightly higher than where you've placed her. I've got her at number 18, which is in company with the likes of Holly Goodhead and Magda and Lupe Lamora, around that sort of region. Where we differ is on Xenia Onatop. So you mentioned your top 10 is very Connery heavy, as is my top 10, to be fair. But now we have a new entrant into the top 10, and that is Xenia Onatop at 10, just below Honey Rider, just above Octopussy. I really, really liked Onatop in this role. I really liked Famke Janssen in this role as Onatop, and Onatop is one of the more memorable Bond girls for me. And just from school days as well, there was a lot of talk of Onatop, so it's kind of, maybe it's a fuzzy feeling of memories past, but I thought she was really, really good in the role, a really, really strong Bond girl, and villain, which we'll move on to later on, but definitely a top 10, slam dunk. Let's move on to the theme song. So, as we've mentioned several times, GoldenEye, sung by Tina Turner. I thought this was a pretty strong outing, but you know, there's been quite a lot of strong outings, so it's difficult to differentiate. I've plumped for number 7 out of 17, so just below License to Kill, just above For Your Eyes Only. When we get into sort of the top 3, top 5, so, you know, very, very powerful entries in there. It's going to take something pretty special to move those, I would have thought. And GoldenEye gets close, but for me, it's not one of the strong ones. It's not a standout song, but solid nonetheless. What about you, Jay? What are your thoughts on GoldenEye, the theme song?
I think it's a strong entry, and for me, like I've done a few times before in previous weeks, I've had to listen to the song a few times on say Spotify or YouTube, and then compare it to one of the other songs. So for me, I was listening to GoldenEye and License to Kill by Gladys Knight a few times back to back to kind of see, does GoldenEye go in at number 5 or number 6? And for me, it was just slightly weaker than License to Kill by Gladys Knight, so it comes in at 6. So that's obviously, it's a strong entry, approaching mid-table, but it's a very good entry. So it's just above The Living Daylights by Aha, and like I said, just below License to Kill. So just to recap, my top 3 is A View to a Kill, Diamonds Are Forever, and Goldfinger. So moving on to the opening credits, and I'm struggling with this one, Andy, because a lot of the opening credits are a bit samey now, and even though I said this one was less sexy compared to previous ones, I've slotted it in at number 8, so I don't really have much to say with this one, Andy. So just so listeners know, that is between License to Kill and at number 7 and Octopussy at number 9. What about you, Andy?
I really liked these opening credits. So for that reason, I've gone with number 4, just behind Goldfinger and just ahead of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I thought the change in mood, maybe it's the less sexualization, or maybe it's just some of the slightly different graphics we've seen, I thought was really stand out, and I really enjoyed it. So yeah, it was always going to rank highly. It was just a matter of where it slotted in. So it's, yeah, number 4. It's a really good entry for me. It'd be interesting to see if any of the other Brosnan films can beat it, because it's a strong debut. Next up, we're going to talk villains, and if my eyes don't deceive me, we have 53 villains in total now, so the list is really stacking up. So obviously we're not going to go through them all, but there are 4 villains from GoldenEye to add to the list. I'm going to start again with the weaker entries, and in summary for me, I think there was 2 pretty strong villains and 2 not so strong villains. So towards the bottom end of the table, I've got General Urumov at 41, and I've got Boris Grushenko at 38. Urimov for me was a bit of a nothing character. He was clearly on the bad side, but didn't really do anything stand out to make him villainous for me. He was just amongst the pack of villains. And similar can be said for Boris in some ways. He was obviously not portrayed as a villain, or seemingly at the start, but then there was something of a reveal that he was actually working for the other side. So there's that element which takes him up a few places. But again, didn't do or say anything massively villainous to make him a standout. So he was just kind of supporting crew in that regard. So that leaves Alec and Xenia. So in terms of the organization, the head honcho would have been Alec. But in terms of my preference, I've actually gone with Xenia above Alec in this instance. So I've gone with Alec at 13, and you'll notice a thing with both of my choices here, just above Max Zorin from A View to a Kill. I thought he was a very strong villain. I thought the reveal of him to be the villain was very, very powerful, and obviously there was that personal element to it as well, which added. But I thought it was a very strong showing by Sean Bean. I really enjoyed him in this role. But Xenia Onatopp for me is top 5. She goes in at number 5, just above Mayday, played by Grace Jones, also from A View to a Kill. I thought there was a lot of parallels between the two characters. You know, the strong, powerful female sidekick that can hold their own and actually outshone their main villain counterparts in some ways. And Xenia was just one of those characters that is so memorable and so strong. I really, really enjoyed her role. Really enjoyed her part in this. So yeah, top 5 for me. How does that compare with yours, Jay?
We've got quite a few differences here, Andy, and I've just changed one of my rankings actually. So I'm going to start from bottom like Andy did. So for me, Boris was the weakest out of the 4 villains in this one. So Boris came in at number 46. He's very much a supportive villain, so a secondary villain, but he's a bit of a wussy, isn't he, in this as well? So I couldn't really put him any higher than that. And I think we've got quite a few big differences here. So I put General Oromov at 32. So I did have him higher, but I've literally just changed it listening to what you were saying, and I agree. He's not very scary. He works for Alec, so he's a secondary villain as well. So I put him in at 32, which is just below Brad Whitaker and just above Necros in The Living Daylights. So again, sandwiched between The Living Daylights, the 80s films. But I think he's a good character, but he's not the strongest. But when I look at the people below him, I couldn't put him below those. So people like Chang from Moonraker, Gobinda, Mishka and Grishka from Octopussy, Sander, I couldn't really put him lower than those characters. So that's why I put him in there. But originally, you know, as we started recording this, I did have him above General Orlov. But listening to what you were saying and thinking about, you know, when we watched Octopussy, General Orlov was more intimidating and was driving the bad guys' plot, whereas General Oromov, he was working for Alec, so very much a secondary character. The big difference here is Xena. So I put Xena in at number 26, so not in my top 20. I think, you know, she is scary. I agree. There were some parallels with Mayday. Mayday is my number 25 in my list. So, you know, when I put Xena in, I was thinking, yeah, she's very much like Mayday as well. But Mayday is only 25th in my list. So that's why, and I don't think she's as strong as Mayday. So that's why she's one below on my list. Whereas obviously in your list, she's one above. So we're consistent in terms of they're near each other, but it's just where they are is different. And Alec, so I struggled with this one, Andy, again, because I did my thing of either working for a top or bottom, And for Alec, he obviously was an MI6 agent, and then he appears later on in the film again when he's come back, from the dead. And I don't know. We're coming into the era now of the villains just not being they're not megalomaniac. They're not working for some kind of. He does work for the Janus Syndicate, which is obviously some kind of criminal organization. But when I look through that list and I look through the villains, especially in the Connery era, or even like Roger Moore, where you look at people like Jaws, Max Zorin, you've got Hugo Drax, you've got Dr. Kananga, Mr. Big. I couldn't really put Alec above those characters. So for me, he's in at 18, and I don't know if this is going to be a common theme now in my rankings, where I favour the older style villains. So it'd be interesting to see as we get through the Brosnan films and the Daniel Craig films, if they are going to rank lower than the villains from the 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. So yeah, so we get some differences. So moving on, the movies. So obviously me and Andy said at the top of the podcast what we gave the rating out of 10 was. So just to recap, I gave GoldenEye 8 out of 10. So I said at the beginning of the podcast, I think this is Champions League places. So out of the 17 movies so far, there are 3 movies that have got 8 out of 10. So that's On Her Majesty's Secret Service, From Russia With Love, and GoldenEye. And for me, GoldenEye was a solid 8, but I preferred the other 2 films. So for me, GoldenEye came in at a strong 4th spot. So that's 1 place and 1 mark higher than The Spy Who Loved Me by Roger, featuring Roger Moore. But it does come under the 2 Sean Connerys and George Lazenby films, which is Goldfinger, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and From Russia With Love. So I think 8 out of 10 is a solid entry, a brilliant start from Brosnan. But I feel like this is a bit of a common theme, Andy, where I seem to be, I don't know if it's a bias, but I seem to favour the older films. What about you, Andy?
So, as stated, I give this a 7 out of 10. But in terms of my marks of previous films, I've been less generous, as we've discussed. I've actually only got the 1 film at 8 out of 10, and that was Roger Moore's Live and Let Die, which ranks 2nd. GoldenEye for me ranks 3rd. It shares the 7 out of 10 ranking with a number of Bond films. And it was close to an 8 for me, but I thought Live and Let Die just edged it. But of the various films I've listed, the 7 out of 10, GoldenEye is the strongest. So it's probably the closest to an 8 without being an 8 that I could give it. Again, a very, very solid debut for Brosnan. A very good film. And straight into my top 3. That's a high compliment from me. Next up, we would talk about movies by actor, but of course we've only had the 1 from Brosnan so far, which is GoldenEye. I will be very interested to see if any of his subsequent films can beat it, because it's set the bar pretty high.
So the last one in terms of the rankings we're going to talk about is Bond actors, and it's difficult to judge someone on 1 film. However, I think Pierce Brosnan does a stellar job in GoldenEye, and I've put him in at number 2, Andy. And I think, it's been years since I've rewatched the other Brosnan films, but I do think this is probably going to be his strongest one. And in terms of the rankings for Roger Moore films, they tended to be a bit lower than the Connery films. And I think Brosnan, he has everything in terms of playing Bond. He's smooth. He's a killer, strong 47 kills straight away. One-liners, he's funny as well, so he's witty. So I do feel he's more one of the more rounded actors that played Bond. So for me, he's gone in at number 2. So he hasn't dislodged Connery yet. He might do in his in his other films that we watch over the next few weeks, but I think is a solid entry. And it's difficult, with one film under his belt, but for me, I do prefer to watch a Pierce Brosnan Bond compared to a Roger Moore Bond. What about you?
Yeah, so I've also gone with Brosnan as second behind Connery, but above Moore. And this is where, obviously, we're treating the performance of the actor slightly different to the overall enjoyment of the film. Because if you think back to the rankings, I've actually got the Roger Moore debut as my second favourite Bond film so far, with an 8 out of 10, whereas GoldenEye I gave 7 out of 10. But I felt the performance of Brosnan in GoldenEye is stronger than anything I've seen from Moore so far. And I think the reason that I ranked the film lower is not because of Brosnan's effort, it was other factors like, logical plot holes or some dodgy scenes here and there or a little bit of silliness. But Brosnan as Bond I thought was tremendous. Connery remains the benchmark, remains the gold standard. There's still 3 films left for Brosnan to try and knock him off his perch. It's going to be difficult, but we look at them objectively. It's just our opinion, so it could still happen, or he could still drop down if his performance weakens. But I thought as a debut performance, it was tremendous. So straight in at number 2, and I wasn't expecting him to be that high, to be honest. But I really enjoyed his portrayal of Bond.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. So, is there anything else we want to discuss before we finish GoldenEye this week?
We could discuss for hours and hours and hours the GoldenEye video game, which was a staple of my childhood. A tremendous game, and has been voted like one of the best games of all time. And I was worried when we were preparing to watch the film again for the first time in however many years. I wondered whether things I thought I remembered from the film, I was actually remembering them from the video game, and whether the two were the same or not. So I kind of had to check myself a little bit. But we won't go into detail. We'll maybe park that thought, but it just comes to mind that it was such an iconic, famous, well-loved video game as an accompaniment to the film. It really really sets the franchise out.
I agree, and I know we spoke about this off air, but we used to play GoldenEye when I was at university on the PC emulator version of GoldenEye, and we used to play 4-player LAN games, so that was very enjoyable. So Andy, do you just want to remind listeners what our next film is, next week's episode?
Yeah, so episode 18 next week will be the second outing for Pierce Brosnan as Bond, and it's one of those films where there's mentions of life and death in various things. So we've had Live and Let Die, and we've got No Time to Die, and we've got Die Another Day. But the one that lives forever is tomorrow, because tomorrow never dies.
Well, that's this week's episode done. We hope you enjoyed it.
Special thanks to the band Sugar Tongue for the theme tune to The Rating Room. You can find them on all the usual social media channels, and be sure to check out their song The System, available now on Spotify.
You can find and message us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok and Instagram by searching The Rating Room.
You'll find all our social media links on our website, theratingroom.com, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, or feel free to drop us an email at theratingroom@gmail.com. Goodbye, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week, right here on The Rating Room.
The Rating Room. The Rating Room. The Rating Room.